Well, I think there are two developments. One I would say is positive, but does create challenges for democracy. And the other one I would say is negative. And of course, then there's a conflict between them. So the positive development, I think, is one where we have come to recognize that we need to give respect and recognize minority identities that otherwise would be excluded if society just continued to work in terms of a kind of a historic pattern that suits the majority but doesn't adapt to the minority. So I see that development as a kind of multiculturalist development. But it does create challenges for democracy. The other development, which I think of as negative, is in some ways a reaction to the first, though it's a reaction to other things as well. And that this is the kind of populist, authoritarian nationalism that seems to be sweeping the world and is very much a kind of majoritarian nationalism, a majoritarian development. And so the two, this kind of what one might call a bottoms-up minorities movement and a majoritarian reaction, I think the conflict between them is a real challenge for democracy. I really, I am a kind of optimist by nature, but I really don't know whether I can confidently say that democracy will prevail. I think there are a number of worrying trends that are coming together. The one that's most worrying is what I've been referring to as majoritarian nationalism, which tends to be supportive of authoritarian leaders. I think we see this very clearly in the case of Putin. Russia has elections, but not a real democracy. You know, and leaving aside a place like China, where we don't even have a pretense of democracy, but authoritarian party leadership, but also now a very personal leadership with Xi Jinping. I think if you also look at Turkey, Erdogan, the way things have gone there, in India with the election of a Hindu nationalist, Narendra Modi. And then, of course, closer home, we have Trump. We have the kind of some of the populist forces of Brexit in Britain and various populist far-right movements, ultra-nationalist movements in continental Europe. So it is possible to think that democracy could be hollowed out or, if you like, transformed into a kind of majoritarianism, because representative democracy requires all kinds of checks and balances. It requires a certain distribution of power so that it's not all concentrated in the hands of the government, and it's certainly not concentrated in the hands of a leader. So we have, you know, a respected independent judiciary. We have a representative democracy in the form of a parliament, not just about referenda and cult leadership, as is happening. I think that the fact that China is emerging, has emerged as such a major power and clearly will be in the future across this century, I think that too is a worrying development for democracy, because on the whole, people, countries, movements tend to be impressed by the successful. You know, nothing breeds success like success. So when you have liberal democracy being successful, everybody wants to be copying or borrowing from liberal democracy all across the world. But if people think, well, actually, you can have a very successful country which is economically successful, is respected as a global power, and actually achieves this not only without democracy, but actually sees democracy as an obstacle to its power and status, to the way that it can raise the living standards of its people, well, I think there are countries in the world that will say, hey, why don't we do that? Why don't we copy that? So I think these two developments, the shift in democracies themselves from a more representative democracy, which relies on, to some extent, trust and recognition of authority in the hands of representatives, to a more kind of majoritarian ballot-based democracy with one leader. That, and on the other hand, the power and prestige of the Chinese model, I think the two do pose a real challenge to what we think of as liberal democracy. I would say the two things that I'm looking for is, firstly, I think our institutions across civil society as well as within the state need to be more inclusive, and more inclusive in the sense of representing a diverse society. So I think my own interests very much focus on ethnic and religious minorities, but of course other groups as well, groups defined by gender and sexuality and so on. I think we need to make sure that our institutions are diverse and therefore are not vulnerable to the criticism that they are unrepresentative, that they're merely an elite in the bad sense of the word. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think the forces, the popular forces, the social, political tendencies that are opposed to this majoritarian nationalism, this populist authoritarian nationalism, I think they have to come together. And it's not clear at the moment that they have come together or that they are going to come together, but I think that they actually can be strong enough to prevail. But to do that, they need to be much more united around some common ideas and be a common movement. But they at the same time need to be able to persuade some of the people who are attracted to the other trend, namely the majoritarian nationalist trend. Because there's no point in just dividing society up into two. We need to create a real, as it were, popular electoral majority. So we need to persuade some people out of the more negative position into the position that I'm calling positive. And I think to do that, we need to create a sense of common belonging in a diverse population. We need to do it so that we respect diversity, but we also emphasize that we are a country, we are a society, we are together. And I think if we take those two ideas together, not just one or the other, but the two together in what I would like to call what I would like to call multicultural nationalism as the opposite of majoritarian nationalism, I think that is the only feasible alternative to majoritarian nationalism. And maybe that can be successful.